veteran at Pioneer, and she's been a designer, computer IT person, and now she's a business analyst. She spins any fiber she can into yarn, including famously her dog's hair. And I actually felt one of these dog's hair earmuffs last night, and it is surprisingly soft. Sue.
Okay, so back in the mid-90s, I was going through a divorce. And this was a really, really hard time for me. I was freaking out. I had gotten married when I was 18, so I had spent my entire adult life being married. I'd never lived on my own before. I didn't know if I could. I didn't know how. And all of that fear and doubt and insecurity was like this heavy iron chain wrapped around me, weighing me down, making it hard to breathe. But then fast forward, I'm coming up on the 1-year anniversary of my divorce, and in that year, I've learned a few things. I learned that I really can live on my own. I'm not going to end up starving and homeless. And in addition to that, I also learned that not only can I live on my own, I actually like it. So I decided to celebrate this knowledge and this new perspective by having an adventure. So I decided that I would take a trip by myself, something else I had never done before, and I planned a 10-day trip to Washington State. I was going to spend 10 days roaming around the western part of Washington, having different types of adventures. Well, one of those adventures was a 3-day sea kayaking trip in Puget Sound. So the day that the trip was supposed to start, I went to Anacortes and I caught a very early morning ferry for the 2-hour ride out to Friday Harbor. And when I got to Friday Harbor, I met up with the guides and the rest of the people that I was going to be spending the next few days with. And we were standing there on a beach of a small bay on this island, and we were getting some instruction and some orientation, and we were stowing the gear in the kayaks. And it was a very gray, drippy day. The air was really heavy and wet, and we were all wearing rain gear. And I'm standing there on the beach, looking out across the bay, through the mist, and thinking, what have I gotten myself into? I've never done anything like this before. I don't know what I'm doing. But then the time for thinking was past. It was time to paddle. So we all get in our kayaks, we shove offshore, and we're paddling across the bay. And just about the time we get to the mouth of the bay, right in front of us, this pair of dolphins leaps out of the water, side by side, makes this big graceful arc through the air, and then splashes back down into the water again. And I thought to myself, this is going to be awesome. And it really was, because not too long after that, the sun came out, the sky cleared, we ditched the rain gear, and the whole group just was practically giddy with the excitement and the adventure of all this. People would start exploring on their own, and the boats would get all spread out. And then at some point, maybe 2 or 3 boats would cluster together, and people would talk and chat, get acquainted, compare notes. And then they'd spread out again and maybe reform in another group later. It was like a floating cocktail party. And it worked out really well because we were all in at least tandem kayaks. So everybody had a paddle buddy. And my paddle buddy happened to be one of the guides, Carrie. And Carrie's real job was marine and fisheries biologist. So she knew a lot about oceans. Me, I've spent my entire life in the Midwest, about 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean. Not so much. But I tend to be a really curious person, so with just a few questions, we were off to the races. We had discussions about tides and currents and the geology of the sound. We talked about the shipping lanes and the big ferries and fishing boats and cargo ships that use the fishing or the shipping lanes all across the sound. We talked about whatever came up. literally, because at one point this young seal pops its head up to take a look at us. It was just 3 feet from me. But that was enough to start a whole different series of conversations. And that was just kind of how the whole day went. It was exploring, it was talking, it was learning. It was so engaging and fascinating. So much so that by the time it was late afternoon and we were paddling up to Stewart Island, where the guide said, "This is where we're going to camp for the night," I'm thinking, really? Already? It was just such a wonderful day. But by the time we had set up camp and had supper and the sun went down, I was more than aware of what a really long physical day it had been. I crawled into my tent, I flattened out on my sleeping bag, and I don't think I moved until morning. But when morning came, I woke up and I was really ready and eager to do it all over again. So I crawled out of my tent and I discovered that the entire island is just blanketed in this really thick, heavy fog. And you know, people talk about a pea soup fog, but this was the pea soupiest fog I've ever seen in my life. It was incredibly thick. It was also a problem. Our original plan for the second day was that we would break camp, pack up the kayaks, and then spend all day paddling over to this other island where we would camp for the second night. And the problem with that plan was that to get to this other island, we had to cross the shipping lanes. And in normal, good visibility conditions, that's not a problem. But with the fog that day, it would have been like trying to cross a busy highway while blindfolded. And our guides decided that that just wasn't safe. We couldn't do that. We needed a plan B. So the plan B they came up with was that we would paddle around Stewart Island and then come back to that same campsite to camp for the second night. So, cool. We get in our kayaks, we paddle across the harbor, we take a right-hand turn, and we start our day. Well, in addition to changing our plans for the day, the fog also changed the nature of the day. There was none of that cocktail party atmosphere. With that fog, everybody stayed so close together because nobody wanted to get separated in the fog. And it also changed how we navigated because we couldn't see the island that we were paddling around. What we had to do was be very quiet and listen. We had to listen for the sound of waves hitting the shore. As long as we could hear that sound to our right, we would know that the island was still over there somewhere. So it was a very subdued and quiet group that day. And everything was quiet until one of the guides says, "You hear that?" And the other guide says, "Yeah, let's go." And they start paddling like their lives depended on it. And at this point, I have no idea what's going on. But when your guide says, "Let's go," and starts paddling, you don't ask questions, you just paddle. So we're all just paddling as hard as we can. And then that goes on for a couple of minutes until suddenly the guide stopped paddling. So we stopped paddling. And then in that new stillness and quiet, I heard it too. From somewhere behind and to the left of us, and then off to the right. And then I figured it out. We were in the middle of a pod of orca whales that had come up to breathe. In the fog, we couldn't see them at all. But we knew that those multi-ton animals were all around us because we could hear them breathe. Now, looking back on that rationally, I can do the math. I know that that whole experience could not have lasted more than 2 minutes. But it was a moment in time that was unforgettable. It was like that scene in The Wizard of Oz where everything goes from black and white to Technicolor. Because for me, that was the moment where the black and white of, I've never done this before, I don't know if I can do this, became the Technicolor of, I can do this, I did this. And that moment has stayed with me all of these years. And anytime I face that black and white of doubt and uncertainty, I know that I can close my eyes and I can be back there in the fog with the orca whales, and I can breathe.